All right, well, let's turn again to 1 Peter chapter 5, please. 1 Peter chapter 5. We're moving through this little letter. We are getting close to the end. But as we start, I want to ask you a question. And I don't want you thinking, I want you looking around and thinking about something else. I want to ask you a question as we get started. How would you define success? If I ask you today to define success, what words would you use? Now, we all grew up in the same culture, the same age, so I don't know what you would say, but I know what our culture would say, and many of us would probably use some of the same words. We would probably describe success as someone who has a large following, someone that's famous, has a lot of education, makes a lot of money, has a lot of influence. Well, today, Peter's going to define success for us, and he's going to do it God's way. And I think it's very shocking the way Peter is going to define success. And this is a challenge for each and every one of us to jump out of our culture and live God's way. He's going to define success using two words: humility and submission. Humility and submission. Executive Digest magazine said this: the trouble with success is that the formula is the same as the one for a nervous breakdown. Isn't that true? You're going to work all day, work all night, work 7 days a week, no time off, just drive, drive, drive. It is the same formula for a nervous breakdown. Another publication said, if you don't have any time for yourself, any time to hunt or fish, that's success. Don Strickland would not like that. No time to hunt. Don would not like that. Years ago, in a long time ago in a previous life, I had a job working for a major Fortune 500 firm, and the advertisements were written in such a way that in the sales literature was, you need to fund your retirement, put money in an IRA, and put money aside in a 401k, and just do it. And when you get to that point, when you finally just retire, it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be great. You're going to be able to travel. You're going to be able to do this and do that. Just do it, do it, do it. And people would just put it away, and there's nothing wrong with putting it away. But then that day would finally come, and they say, okay, we've made it. And I can't tell you how many times 6 months later, the guy was dead. Or a year later, she had a stroke and she was flat on her back for the rest of her life. But it's going to be wonderful, and it may be wonderful, but it may not be wonderful. So we got to be careful on how we define these things. Well, Peter is addressing, if you remember what we dealt with last week, he's dealing with young men now. And if you're here and you're not a young man, it applies to you. The principles that we're dealing with actually apply to each and every one of us. And his point is that God has a purpose for your life and my life, whatever that may be. And we're going to see that purpose in this humbling ourselves to be successful in God's eyes, it involves two aspects. The first aspect is discipline. It involves discipline on your part and discipline on my part. And it's interesting, we have a verse in Job that I want to read for you. Now, Job was a very disciplined man, and the Bible holds Job up as this great example of patience for us. But folks, there are many times in Job's life and in his story, he's not very patient. But yet God himself says that Job is a great example of patience. So I'm going to read from Job chapter 30, verse 21. Now remember, Job's going through it now. He's right in the middle of this terrible situation. And in verse 21, he says, speaking of the Lord, you have become cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. This is the man that the Bible holds up to us as a great example of patience. So you can slip and fall in your life, and from time to time, maybe not have patience, but still be, in God's eyes, viewed as a godly man or a godly woman. The other example that's needed and recorded for us here in the book of Deuteronomy, we have the idea of deliverance. The Lord can deliver you and deliver me. And in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 26, we find these words, 9:26. This is, I have prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord God, do not destroy your people. He's trying to deliver the people, even your inheritance, whom you have redeemed through your greatness, whom you have brought out of Egypt with a mighty hand. So the theme there is the mighty hand. Job talks about the mighty hand, and that's what we're going to be dealing with today, is the mighty hand of God, as Peter looks at that in chapter 5. So what he tells us to do there in verse 6, let's look at it. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. Now this is interesting because we who believe in the sovereignty of God and nothing happens by luck or chance, and there's not one molecule loose anywhere in the universe that isn't under God's control, here Peter writes, humble yourself. This is something you do. This is something I do. Okay, how do we do it? One way we do it, looking back on Job and looking back on Deuteronomy, we need to learn, folks, to accept what the Lord brings into our lives. The sovereign God has a path for you and a path for me, and that's what we've been studying on Sunday nights, the idea of God's path for you and me. So we need to learn to not fight the providence of God in our lives. Now, we all at times are tempted to manipulate the situation, take matters into our own hands. Realize God's hand is in your life. Now, sometimes we want the Lord to move faster, don't we? We all want that. I want it at times. But this requires us to be humble. You humble yourself and accept His providence. Now, the great example of that is Joseph in Genesis, and we all know the story of Joseph, so I'm not going to stay there long, but we read where Joseph was sold as a slave. His own brothers sold him as a slave, and we just read that and we move on. But just stop and think about what that means. Separated from his family for years against his will, raised in a culture he didn't want to be a part of, and after he gets through all that, God raises him up. So in chapter 50, he's in a position of power. His brothers are in front of him. He's confronting his brothers who sold him. And notice what he says. As for you, you meant evil against me. Now that's a fact. That's true. They did. But notice what he goes on to say. But God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. There's a man, Joseph, who humbled himself, and then God raised him up at the proper time. This is amazing. One man said, Christians should never resent the experiences of life and should never rebel against them because they know that the mighty hand of God is there. Now, Mary, think about Mary. She's engaged to Joseph. She probably has her life all planned out. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be great. If it was today, it would be something like, I'm going to finish college. We're going to get married. I'm going to have these children. I'm going to have a wonderful career, whatever it may be. And the God says, no, I don't think so. Oh, by the way, you're not married yet, and you're also pregnant. What? Now, Mary's a teenager at this point, a teenager. And in Luke chapter 1, verse 46, we see her praising the Lord for what He has done in her life. Threw her plans out, I'm on a new path now, Lord, and I'm praising you for it. She's a teenager. Moses. Oh, I love this story that's found in Numbers chapter 11. Maybe I shouldn't love it because it's not really a good compliment to God's people, but the story itself is just fascinating. Now, God has delivered his people out of Egypt. They're now free. They used to be slaves, okay? Now, think about how wonderful that is. And God's feeding them every day. It's free food. They don't have to work for it. What do? Now they're going to complain because there's no meat. Maybe it's a vegetarian diet. I don't know. But they're complaining now because they don't have meat. Listen in Numbers 11, verse 4. The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel, think about this, wept again. Why? Who will give us meat to eat? They're weeping because they don't have meat. We remember that fish we used to eat in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, all the onions and the garlic. How wonderful it was. Now, verse 19, God says, they read, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat. For we were so well off in Egypt. Well off in Egypt? They were slaves. We were well off in Egypt, therefore the Lord will give you meat and you shall eat. I love this story. God says, you want meat? Okay, I'll give you meat. I'll give you meat for breakfast. I'll give you meat for lunch. I'll give you meat for dinner. I'll give you meat for a midnight snack. I'll give you meat till it's coming out of your nose. That's what he says here, verse 20. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils. God gave them meat. And now Peter writes, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. One commentator said that statement is a snapshot of the entire Christian life. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. Now that same mighty hand can also lift you up. Verse 6, therefore humble yourself in the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, or the due time. Now think about Abraham. God promised Abraham a child. Well, time's going by. Abraham's getting old, and he thinks, this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to work. My equipment doesn't work like it used to. My wife's equipment doesn't work like it used to. I don't think there's ever going to be a baby. So what did he do? He took matters into his own hands. Now, folks, don't you have to admit we all do that from time to time, or we're tempted to do that from time to time? The problems that you see in the Middle East today, the Middle East is exploding with war and terrorism. It all goes back to Abraham taking matters into his own hands on that day. And we're still dealing with the consequences. David with Bathsheba. He saw Bathsheba and he said, I want that woman. And he took matters into his own hands. Matthew chapter 14. Herod wants another man's wife, and John the Baptist says, you can't have her. And what did he do? He just finished off John the Baptist. So we want to help God out, don't we? We want to help God get things going. We want to prime the pump from time to time. But the Bible tells us that there is first the cross, then the crown. First the cross in your life, then the crown. First there is suffering. Handle that right, then there will be glory. Think about Moses. Moses is probably the most highly educated man in the Old Testament. At 40 years old, he has the best education that Egypt can offer. He wants to deliver the people, and he says, Lord, I'm ready. And God said, no, you aren't. So what does God do? He takes Moses, he puts him on the backside of the desert, leaves him there for 40 years. He's now 80 years old. God approaches Moses and says, hey, Moses, I think you're ready. And Moses said, no, I'm not. I'm too tired. Well, if Moses had delivered the people at age 40, everyone would have given Moses the credit for it. But at age 80, now they're going to give God the credit. God lifted him up. Then he delivered the Jews. Joseph again. Joseph spent years in prison for something that he wasn't guilty of. 13 years. But he handled it well. Then God lifted him up to the throne. Now we become impatient with God. Isn't that true? Will you admit that we do? I know I do. So Peter's now going to give us a list of commands, laws for the Christian life, successful living in the Christian life. And we see that God is in control of our lives no matter what's going on. And God has a destiny for you and for me. Thank you for the water. Last part of verse 6. Why are we going to humble ourselves? So that he may exalt you at the proper time. The results of the promise that he will exalt you at the proper time. Now, the great biblical illustration of that would be David. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, we see David. He isn't famous. He wasn't always a king. Here we see a young man. He's working with his dad. He's helping taking care of the sheep. He's just a young boy, but this young boy happens to be good at music. He helps out with the sheep and his dad. He's not famous. He's writing songs, and people don't appreciate his music at this point. But what did he do? He kept writing songs. Now, those songs went on to become the book of Psalms. He wasn't trying to sell his music. He wasn't trying to make money. He wasn't trying to become famous. One writer said the book of Psalms are David's top hits. The book of Psalms are David's top hits. He wrote his songs to glorify God. What's the Shorter Catechism? Question 1. The chief end of men, women, and children, glorify God and enjoy him forever. David was humble, and then God raised him up at just the right time, that he may exalt you at the proper time. Think about Jesus. Jesus resisted efforts to start his ministry at a younger age. People around him were encouraging him to get started and do this and do that, and Jesus said, no, it's not my time yet. He resisted that, and then his time came. Now, here's something I want you to think about during the week. At this point, we see God's hand can help you or it can oppose you. God's hand can help you or it can oppose you. God can humble you. Now, I'll guarantee you it's going to be a lot easier if you do it yourself than if God does it. And you pull me aside, I can tell you about times in my life when God humbled me, when I should have humbled myself, and it would have been a lot easier if I'd have just done it on my own. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where he lists all the physical things that he suffered through. Then he said, besides all that, there's the pressure of dealing with all of the churches. So Paul humbles himself. All right, last part of verse 7. I'm going to skip the first part for now. Casting all your anxiety into him. Why? Because he cares for you. Why are you humbling yourself? Why are we doing these things? Because he cares for you. Now, one translation put it, it matters to God about you. It matters to God about you. One man said, life is out to break us, but God is out to make us. Life is out to break us, but God is out to make us. Romans 8:28, you know it well. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord. Now that's a promise for God's people, but it's a conditional promise. If you don't love the Lord, you can't claim that promise. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord. So we all carry burdens. You came in here with burdens. I know that because I have mine. The burdens that you came in here with and the burdens that you carry, folks, can drive us to despair. And it isn't easy to overcome them. It isn't easy. Now, Peter says, I want you to throw it on the Lord. I want to read you a quote from Vance Havner, who was a preacher in the 20th century. He writes, when I started out, the devil said, you mean well, but if you try to stay humble and childlike these days, you'll be run over by the steamroller. Now, that's the culture we live in. And our culture wants you to become part of the steamroller. But Peter doesn't want you to do that. Peter says success is through humility and submission. He's trying to give us all faith in the future. And we don't know what the future holds, but Peter wants us to give faith in the future because of who holds the future. Philippians chapter 4, I'm just going to read one verse there. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, we read, be anxious for nothing. Now there's that one word, nothing. I mean, Lord, come on. Can't I be anxious about something? No, be anxious for nothing. Then he tells us what to do. You put off and you put on. So put off being anxious. What do we put on? But in everything by prayer, supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And what's the result? And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. And that's where it is. It's the battle between the heart and the mind. Now, anxiety. Casting all your anxiety on Him. Let's just dig into that a little bit, and we'll get to it more in a minute. Discontentment, discouragement, despair, pain, suffering, trials. And Paul had his share of that. He shared that with us, and we've looked at it from time to time. So remember, this is a problem, but it doesn't have to be sin. This is a problem, but it doesn't have to be sin. Now, Peter lived this out. He walked with Jesus. He saw Jesus do wonderful things. What did he see Jesus do? Jesus healed his mother-in-law. He gave Peter a boatload of fish. He helped Peter pay his taxes. He enabled Peter to walk on the water. He recreated the servant's ear that Peter cut off in a moment of anger and sin. He got Peter out of prison in Acts chapter 12. So let me make this statement. I want you to think about it, okay? Anxiety is normal in a fallen world. Anxiety is normal in a fallen world. But the lesson is God cares for you. Now, when you give your anxiety to Him. So when you give your anxiety to Him, what will He do? He'll give you the courage to face your problem and not sin. Jesus had anxiety in His life, but He didn't sin. He'll give you the wisdom to understand your problem, whatever it is. He'll give you the strength to do what you need to do about your problem. Now, one thing I didn't share with you last week, because it was just one point, but there was one commentator that outlined this section under what he called the 3 A's. And the first A we looked at last week, which was authority. The Lord wants us to submit to the authority in our life. Now, when you move into verse 2, we now see the second A, which is anxiety. And this is the next command of God He has for us for godly success. The command for godly success. And this involves absolute surrender on your part and my part, and no panic. He wants us to absolutely surrender and to do it without panic. For verse 7, casting all your anxieties on Him. So casting means to throw. And if you'll notice here again, You are not passive here. You are 100% active. You're the one that's going to cast. You're the one that's going to throw. This is a chosen course of action on your part and my part. This is how you humble yourself. So our lives do not depend on manipulating our circumstances. Moses, Abraham, Steve Hill, all of us. One writer calls this idea radical surrender. I like that. Radical surrender. So casting involves throwing something onto someone else. Now, this word casting is used in Luke 19, where Jesus is going into Jerusalem on the donkey, and they're casting their coats on the donkey. It's the same word. So Peter wants us to throw this on the Lord, to proactively, not passive, throw it on the Lord. All right, so what are we going to throw on the Lord? Anxiety. I haven't defined the word much yet, so let's dig in a little bit more. Anxiety is the state of being pulled apart. So how many of you here today are in the state of being pulled apart? I'm going to pull from Matthew chapter 6, reading verse 34. Matthew 6:34. Jesus said, "Do not worry about tomorrow." Now, how many of us are here today worrying about tomorrow? I know. We're all in the same boat. Jesus said, "Do not worry about tomorrow." Why? For tomorrow will take care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Don't you have enough things to be concerned about today without having to be concerned about tomorrow and that doctor's appointment or that exam or whatever it may be? Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. "For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life, as to what you will eat, what you will drink, not for your body, as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, reap, nor gather, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they?" Go home and read the rest of that section. It's very, very encouraging. Someone said, "Once and for all, give all of our cares, past, present, and future, to the Lord." I appreciated Neil's prayer because that's what he prayed. He prayed about the past, the present, and the future. So the term that Peter's using here comes from the fishing industry of his day. Now, he's an old man now, but he grew up a fisherman, and you never really outgrow where you came from and what you used to do. So he's pulling from the fishing industry of his day. And those nets had to be thrown, and they were big, and they were heavy, and when they were wet, they got even heavier. When they had fish in them, they were just weighed down. So Peter's thinking about all of us just being weighed down like those heavy nets. Cast your anxiety and your cares and the things that weigh you down. What's weighing you down today? Go home. Cast it on the Lord. Get alone. Read this out loud. Say, "Lord, I'm casting it on you." And use your hands. Picture that problem in your hand and just throw it. That's what he's talking about. But there's that one word again. Casting some of your anxiety on him. Okay, all right, Lord, I can do that. Not what it says, is it? He just won't let me have any wiggle room, Neil. None, okay? Casting all. Lord, did you have to put that word in there? Casting all of your anxiety, because we want to give it to the Lord a little bit at a time. I'm going to hold on to this problem, but I'm going to give you that problem, Lord. I can handle this one over here, Lord. Now, worry is a sin. And there's a book in the back, and if you don't have it, please go and pick up a copy of it. We give it to all of our first-time visitors. It's called Respectable Sins. And the book's about respectable sins that we all practice, and worry is one of them. And why is it respectable? Because we all do it. And I'll even catch myself. I'll start to say, I'm worried about this, and I know that's a sin, so I'll change my language and say, I'm concerned about this. But you know, the Lord knows my heart. The Lord knows I'm just playing word games here. But I don't want to use the word worry. It shows a lack of faith in the Lord, what it does. And we're all, even your elders are guilty of that. Your deacons are guilty of that. We're all in the same boat here. All right, let's go back and summarize a little bit. I started off by asking you to define success. Okay, have you thought about how you would answer that? How you would answer that question? Or do you want to answer it God's way? God has given us the formula here. He gave us the 3 A's. We submit to the authority in our lives. Then he wants to deal with our attitude. That's the second A. What is your attitude as you submit to the authority in your life? And the third A is our anxiety. He wants us to cast it on the Lord. So is your definition of success today power, fame, money, education? Or is it God's definition, which is humility and submission? Wow, what a big difference. What a great difference. All right, let's pray.